I'm extremely anxious about the word meta because of how it's been used in so many different ways. Like in tech culture, when I hear meta, generally, I hear an evasion of responsibility.
We sent 200,000 text messages, SMS, to random numbers around Taiwan asking one simple question: what to do about information integrity online. And people give us very good ideas. Let's label all the advertisement as probably scam until Jason Huang digitally signs off it.
For a decentralized network like a blockchain, you need a centralized protocol. You need, and often, a foundation that's kind of guiding the development of it.
If we show constant adaptability, the ability to self-heal, to care, I think that is a very important foundational principle. And I call this civic care. And so I've been building a microsite, a research project in Oxford called sixpack.care. And so in this website, it shows the 6 mechanisms by which that the civic care can exercise itself.
Today, we are exploring a new question, a fundamental question, which is, what kind of digital environments are needed for civil society to govern itself effectively and at scale? And this is what we call meta-politics, which is different from the everyday politics of like right-wing or left-wing, but rather focus on the meta-architecture that shapes political life. And so we all know that technology is neither good nor bad, but it is also not neutral. And so the platform and the protocol that we use today actually define how decisions can be made and also what kind of collective action is or is not possible. And so in this sense, our digital infrastructure is to a large extent governing us. And the question that we want to explore today is whether we can actually design those digital infrastructure in a way that can help us govern ourselves instead. And so we're joined today by 2 amazing guest speakers who have been exploring this challenge in the front line. One from inside government and one from an academic standpoint, but also from the world of digital commons and cooperative governance. So Audrey Tang served as the first Digital Minister of Taiwan and pioneered perhaps some of the most interesting experiments in digital democracy, from the civic hacking movement, GovZero, to the participatory platform vTaiwan. Audrey is also the co-author of the book Plurality, The Future of Collaborative Technology and Democracy, which essentially presents a vision on how technology can be used to strengthen democratic participation rather than undermining it. And then Nathan Schneider is a professor of media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder and also the author of the book Governable Spaces, Democratic Design for Online Life. And Nathan has been exploring the question of implicit feudalism in today's digital platforms and how concentrated power and extractive corporate practices actually fragment online community rather than empowering them. Nathan is also a leading voice in the platform cooperativism movement, where he's exploring how we can actually build digital spaces where community are actually owning and governing those spaces. And so together, we will explore how network nations can be regarded as meta-political environments that embed democratic values directly into their own governance substrates, hopefully managing to transform digital infrastructure and network technology from those instruments of corporate control into mechanisms that are actually promoting civic engagement and democratic empowerment. Cool, thank you both for joining us. I'm very happy that you get to meet Audrey and Nathan for the first time on this podcast. Hopefully it's going to be a fast and long collaboration that emerge. So we're going to jump in immediately. So the topic today is meta-politics. We're going to explore a little bit what it is and then how it applies to network nations.
Cool. Yeah, and I think we would love to bring you, Nathan, in to kind of like, set the scene together with us and help us unpack the meaning of metapolitics. You published a a very interesting book, like about a year ago, I think, called Governable Spaces. And I think the idea of governable spaces really resonates a lot with this concept of meta politics, and especially how it intersects with the like infrastructures which are confining like the environments in which we are as a society coordinating in the first place. So maybe you can help us understand the concept a little bit better, and maybe riff a little bit on your book and the insights from your book.
Sure. And first of all, thank you for having me, and it's such a pleasure to meet Audrey. Good to be with you, Felix and Primavera. The First of all, also the other preface is that I'm extremely anxious about the word meta because of how it's been used in so many different ways. Like in tech culture, when I hear meta, generally, I hear an evasion of responsibility. Oh, let's go meta. Let's, like the company Meta became called Meta when it was trying to escape all of this accountability for political crisis that it had created. And so I think we need to be very anxious when people go meta and try to transcend the real problems that our world is facing. But I do think it is important to allow ourselves to talk about something like meta politics, and we can come to that historically, with the recognition, for instance, that the structures that we take for granted today for our political life, like the nation state and so forth, are, you know, very, very recent developments, especially as universal forms. The expectation that every piece of land on Earth would be the dominion of one country, is just a relatively recent idea born of a particular European experience related to the Reformation and wars of religion and that sort of thing, and then got spread through a series of historical accidents, and is not the only way that we could organize the world. And in Governable Spaces, the book you mentioned, I explore the possibilities of governance in online space, and the more you work out those possibilities and play with them and see where some experiments and tendencies could lead, you start to realize, this meta politics of, say, the nation state might start to break down pretty quickly. It's not gonna last. It doesn't hold up against the possibilities of self-governing online networks. Once you start being able to be a citizen of a network, once you start seeing politics as connected to the fact that, hey, right now we're talking across all these continents, we're building community across all these political territories, maybe that community itself is a kind of emerging politics. Then you start to realize, oh boy, we're not just talking about, oh, let's make a minor tweak or reform around online platforms, but you start seeing a different kind of politics emerging. And I've really become obsessed with that right now, and it's that kind of thinking that is driving a lot of my current work now.
Super interesting. So I think like one of the decisive factors in shaping new forms of politics and political organization to emerge in the first place are, of course, like the technological infrastructures in which they are taking place. So you are outlining quite interestingly, I think, also in your book, how the current environment is constraining a lot of civic organization and the potential indeed of like self-sovereign communities to emerge. Maybe you can help us unpack a bit, like what is the problem space a bit at the moment? Like how do these environments look like? How do they shape our political actions? And how could alternatives be formulated?
Well, I think the problems come from a few directions. The limitations, I should say. One is kind of technical. There are certain aspects of the architecture of the web, in particular, around the server-client relationship, which puts a lot of power in where the server happens to be located geographically. And that becomes a kind of point of failure, especially in relationship to territorial nations. And this goes back to the very earliest online communities with BBSs, when people started realizing, oh, wait, I have legal liability for all the conversation that's happening on this server sitting in my house. And that played out all the way to, major tech companies located in particular jurisdictions holding huge data centers and realizing, oh, we have legal liability for the stuff here too. And then norms formed around it, norms that didn't expect democracy, that didn't expect participatory spaces, because we were kind of running on the idea that, oh, we're just being hosted by in the house party was kind of the metaphor of a lot of these early communities, or even the commune, which often had a kind of dominating leader. There were a number of these metaphors that didn't need democracy and didn't need practices of democratic life to be built in. And so they weren't built into our online tools. And then now we see the kind of all-encompassing nature of territorial regulation, with the rise of blockchains and cryptocurrency. Love them or hate them, doesn't really matter. It's just a piece of technology, but it did present the possibility of departing from that old client-server relationship and actually having networks designed to be co-governed by multiple participants. So there you have a chance to actually exit some of those old constraints, but then territorial regulation stepped in and said, no, actually, we're not going to respect your DAO as like an organization. You have to double register it as a company with us, and we're going to basically take out all the possibilities of that would enable you to do anything new. And that's in part for some really good reasons. How else are you going to get a certain kind of accountability? But on the other hand, it's constrained the kind of institutional creativity that the technology itself could enable. I think the trick is this technology is sticky in a way and can do things that other past regimes can't. And even though it's been slow to take hold in a lot of people's everyday lives, it is slowly growing in its stickiness, and we're seeing regulations start to develop new relationships with it. And as this occurs, I think it becomes more and more inescapable that we end up with network native forms of organization, network native forms of self-governance, network native forms of economic life that challenge that monopoly that the Westphalian nation state has had for the past few centuries.
So I can add a small follow-up to this. I'm actually very interested in, like, do you see that, how do you see the relationship between those different flavors of governable spaces, but like online, where you have like, you have like the centralized feudal system, which is coexisting with the more decentralized system, and like, what's the relationship with them, but perhaps more importantly, like the extent to which you see the governable space of the nation state, or like the more legacy one, actually, do you see a relationship between, for instance, like the nation state, it is promoting or impinging upon some of those design structure of governance online, and vice versa? Do you see how the advent of some of those online governable spaces, whether it's like the functional sovereign that all of students have like more power than the nation state, or those decentralized infrastructure, is there like a symbiotic, is there a non-symbiotic, is there a competitive relationship between the more like nation state structure and online structures?
Well, I think they've kind of gotten into a lock right now. At least in the U.S., for instance, the context I know best, where, for instance, whenever something seems to go wrong in online space, like children are being abused, or politics is going awry, or all sorts of things, what happens is the people who consider themselves the responsible parties in government haul in the CEOs of the biggest tech companies, either to pay homage, as seems to be happening a lot today, or to be grilled in Congress and asked all kinds of embarrassing questions and so forth, and having to perform for 13 hours in front of cameras or something like that. In all these cases, the implication is you're the boss, you figure it out, you're in charge of this whole thing. Rather than what, and I think Audrey's work is a really, really powerful counterexample of this, is to say, what if we treated the solutions to problems online through a lens of democracy? What if we saw democracy and self-governance as a way to solve these problems, rather than reinforcing the autocratic tendencies of the server-client relationship. And every time we bring those people in and seem to be making them accountable, we're actually just reinforcing their power. So I think, and again, Audrey has been such a leader in this. We could have an approach where we say, okay, in every time we confront a problem about platform labor, about social media speech, about infrastructure, we said, how could we insert democracy into this problem and enable people to solve it in all kinds of different ways all at once? That's how we solve a lot of problems in other contexts. But in online space, it's always this idea that, we need to haul in the 25-year-old who's in charge of this thing and give him a talking to and reinforce that assumption that dude, usually a dude, is in control.
Yeah, I think, that's a perfect bridge also to, move to you, maybe, Audrey. I think also, interestingly, you often speak of democracy as a social technology, and I feel that kind of echoes to a certain extent some of the insights Nathan just shared about governable spaces and the design options which are enabling or constraining civic society. So to me, at least, and I think Nathan was already riffing on that as well, plurality, the project that you're currently pursuing with a lot of other people and movements together, is a meta-political project in itself to a certain extent. And because it tries to design like a different substrate for others, the democracy, which enables new ways of, deciding together, deliberating together, acting together. So yeah, I just wonder, what does this term metapolitics mean to you, and how can we maybe also leverage it to, enhance democracy in the future?
Yeah, when I hear meta, I think foundational, right? So what are our foundational substrates for coordination? Turns out these are the protocols that people follow. And once people have a better protocol to resolve conflicts, people's imagination of conflicts change. Instead of viewing conflicts as fire on the ground to be put out, we start seeing them as fuel for co-creation. Like before combustion engine, after combustion engine, people have very different perceptions when it comes to fuel. And again, fuel or fire, we need some sort of substrate to harness that into energy. So for example, Nathan just talked about the harms caused by online platforms. For example, last March, there was a lot of deepfake advertisements suddenly appearing on Facebook, on YouTube here in Taiwan. It's usually NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang trying to give you some crypto or giving you some stock options or investment advice to give back to his country or something. But the idea is that we do not need to ask like Meta or YouTube or TikTok CEOs to our legislation to hold them account. We actually can ask everyday people because we already had a protocol, in this case called alignment assemblies. Working with the Collective Intelligence Project, we sent 200,000 text messages, SMS, to random numbers around Taiwan asking one simple question: what to do about information integrity online. And people gave us very good ideas, and thousands of people volunteered. And then we chose randomly 450 people representing the same demographics as Taiwan in rooms of 10, like 45 rooms facilitated by an AI to figure out what to do when deepfake harms come for advertisement platforms. And for example, one room said, let's label all the advertisement as probably scam until Jensen Huang digitally signs off it. Very good idea.
Mhm.
Another room says if somebody gets scammed $5 million because of the investment scam, instead of fining Facebook, let's make them liable for the full damage if they run an unsigned ad. Again, very good idea. And another room says TikTok at the time didn't have a Taiwan office. So if they don't comply, let's not block it because censorship is bad, but let's slow down connection to their servers until all their advertisement business go to their competitor. And so all these ideas are aggregated by a language model. We read them back, people vote, more than 85% of people agree. In April, we checked with all the big tech for feasibility. They're feasible. By May, the Digital Signature Act gets passed, working with trust systems in kind of decentralized notary, and people love that idea. And then in July, the entire law, anti-scam law, passed. So this year, you don't see any deepfake ads anymore in Taiwanese social media. So that's a very concrete thing, saying for each incoming harm, whether it's Uber, like 10 years ago, or deepfake ads last year, we can go through the same protocol so that we can democratically, let me do this again, so that we can democratically steer the incoming technology instead of just pushing the pedal or pushing the brake.
Right. And what do you think are the most relevant design levers we have at the moment? So there is a question, I guess, to which extent we can actually, from a public or civic perspective, shape the platforms which are currently dominating, fields in which civics, communities are organizing. A lot of it is happening at the moment in, big social media platforms. These come with certain constraints and problems. The algorithms are often skewed. There is manipulation happening. Deepfakes and polarization, partially intended, is being incentivized there. So how can we shift and move the playing field to something which is maybe co-constructed by civic society, new and alternative platforms?
Yeah, I think freedom of movement is really the key here, right? In the state of Utah, we, as in the Project Liberty Institute, work with leaders from both parties and the governor to pass a law which is already in effect that says starting next July, if you're a Utah citizen and you want to migrate from one social media network to another, then just like number portability, which lets you keep your telephone number when you switch telecoms, the old network is then legally required to forward all the new likes, new followers, new reactions, new content to your new network. And so in this very simple design called the Digital Choices Act, this is not something that is about nationalizing social media. This is not something that says social media is bad. No, this is just saying if something better comes along, the old social media network should not make it impossible for people to move into the new network just because they have this network effect, they have iron grip on like the connection to your friends and families. They must give those up for interoperability. And again, this is a key decentralized design principle, a meta principle, if you will, which is to enable freedom of choice, of movement across all the different solutions, because then there will be no incentive for the dominant players today to use Cory Doctorow's term, enshittify the experience just because they capture the majority of the market.
Amazing. So this is a very good leeway to our next little set of questions, because basically what we're trying to do with the network nation is precisely to create a better container, a better metapolitical structure. And of course, the question is, how do we design it in a way that actually endorse and promote the specific values that we want to embed into this vessel? So for just like as a reminder, so what we're trying to do with the network nation is that we're creating a container. Of course, this container can be filled up as people wish, but the container itself embeds specific values, and we want to make sure that you can be a left wing and a right wing, and you can still create a network nation. Like the container cannot prevent what's get inside the container, but by shaping specific design structure into that container, it will nonetheless probably influence who wants to use it, but also if you use it, it's going to influence the way in which you can operate within. And so one important point of discussion that we want to have with you both is basically, given our meta design principle that we have with Network Nation, which is basically, of course, the value of plurality, the value of commoning, the value of interdependence and entanglement. So all those values that we actually want to bake into the technology, then how can we construct this vessel in order to design something that can enable, promote civic empowerment and civic participation? And so maybe Audrey, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about as you see, but from the perspective of plurality, because plurality, I guess, is a similar question of the meta framework of plurality invites many different things, but force those things that are inside to still adhere to the plurality principles. So what is your vision in terms of of course, we want to use Network Nation as a tool to promote better democratic participation of civil society. What do you think should be the basic meta design principle that needs to be unconditional into when we think about the design of a network nation.
Yeah, definitely. I think the idea of meta or foundational principles is very important because if we design the protocols right, then it has the ability to self-heal, to care for the polity itself. And if it spirals out of control, then that's a perfect excuse for some nearby polities, maybe nation states, to say, oh, these people cannot take care of themselves. And therefore, a regular Westphalian entity with an army should step in, right? So if we show constant adaptability, the ability to self-heal, to care, I think that is a very important foundational principle. And I call this civic care. And so I've been building a microsite, a research project in Oxford called Sixpack.care. And so in this website, it shows the 6 mechanisms by which that the civic care can exercise itself, in a gym, right? So everybody can grow a 6-pack of care. And these are very briefly attentiveness, the ability to turn the ideological divides within one polity into this uncommon ground, the rarely discovered common ground between them, this bridging map of attentiveness, the idea of responsibility of credible commitments vehicles so that each agent in that polity can make credible commitments that they cannot just override or revoke later. Competency, the idea of training agents using reinforcement learning on community feedback. So like drafting better community notes that bring in people along and how to use constitutional AI to build such agents. So that's competency. And finally, responsiveness, the ability to do local social cultural evaluation so that people can see whether those mechanisms are really fitting people's needs. And if not, there will be an ongoing evaluation of these mechanisms based on the local social cultural expectations. So that's one loop. And then finally, the agentic infrastructure that provides like agent ID, meronymity, partial anonymity, so that the whistleblowing is easy and cooperation is easy, but it also is verified input. And finally, symbiosis, bounding the agents or the protocols to a local care moroscope instead of a paperclip maximizer. So that's the main idea of the 6-pack of care.
Would just love to hear a bit more about how you would imagine instantiating some of these ideas, and a couple thoughts about that. First of all, like for instance, when you think about existing decentralized protocols, they embed certain values and not others. They embed like the value of property, but not and the value of care is instantiated in very limited ways, like through mining or whatever. For instance, no instantiation of like care for the people who are involved. The protocols, unlike, for instance, the Federal Reserve, never check in on whether the people involved are employed. The Federal Reserve has to ask once in a while when making decisions about the money system, hey, are people having jobs? And it's interesting that none of the the cryptocurrencies we've seen have ever asked that. I'm also curious about what the degree to which you can see these kinds of values being embedded in a kind of decentralized way or a kind of centralized way. And I ask this because I think that sometimes we imagine that we can decentralize everything. And I've come to think that some things are gonna be centralized in the same way that, like, to have a decentralized network, you need a centralized, at least in our current systems, a centralized antitrust authority. For a decentralized network like a blockchain, you need a centralized protocol. You need and often a foundation that's kind of guiding the development of it. So I've come to see these two things as kind of as bound together. And so I'm curious about how you think about actually implementing some of these principles.
Yeah, definitely. I think the first attentiveness pack talks about the idea of bridging systems like Polis or the community note system, where the relational health between two sub-communities on X.com or nowadays also YouTube and Facebook is not measured by a simple vote, like whether you can get a majority endorsement from your users. No, right? When you see a community node and vote on it, it measures the unlikeliness of two groups of people or more that like almost always don't vote the same. Like they're very polarized, the left wing and the right wing. And in an adversarial environment like X.com, that is the norm. But there's like this fringe upwing, the very rare kind of nodes that do get support from the left wing and the right wing that don't usually vote the same. And so these are the upwing. And then the idea of community nodes now in their experiments is first to train AI system to draft such nodes and reward AI systems when they can increase the bridging potential of each nodes to bring those two people fragments together again to achieve internal coherence for a subcommunity. And because of this ongoing training, they can also kind of predict like what kind of ideas will bring these people together in the next like rumor cycle so that they can almost pre-bunk such issues and depolarize in advance. So that's a very good protocol to have. And they're trying out on a subset of X.com users now to have that kind of bridge making potential to be their main sorting algorithm instead of the current algorithm, which is kind of engagement through enragement. So that is one very concrete case using a local moral scope polity to train for bridge making and to prioritize relational care as measured by the unlikeliness of the ideological camps to agree, and then the potential for the bridging nodes for them to cohere.
I think like out of the 6-pack, I think there are some that are potentially bakeable into a technological design. I think some of them might not. Some of them are more like social technologies, which I guess cannot really be baked into the structure. And it's more like, I guess some network nation might choose to adopt some of them and some network nation might choose not to. And then it's more like what works and what doesn't work. Hopefully the one that choose to adopt them will be competitively superior and survive better. But I think like there is specific things that really can be embedded into the actual, I guess, social technological design as part of the framework. And then I think there are things that we can perhaps promote or suggest without necessarily embedding them as part of the problem is that when you create a vessel, unfortunately, people will just do whatever they want with the vessel. And I think what we're trying to think very hardly is like, what is the minimal viable vessel that embed as many of those values as we can, but that kind of they need to be there for the vessel to work. And then kind of like these will nudge whoever see this as a powerful vessel will somehow automatically be affected by the technological design of this vessel because it just comes with it, right? And I think like all the thing about entanglement is also part of that. It's kind of like if you manage to structurally entangle, then you can create a better vessel. But also we have to deal now with all the interdependency that you have created through the entanglement, and then what are the technology that can help dealing with this interdependency? And that's where I think the 6-pack become very useful.
Right, which is why I frame the decentralization potential as a freedom of movement. Having the freedom of movement doesn't mean that you move around all the time. Although I did travel to like 25 countries the past year and switching time zone every 7 days, that is not a obligation, right? So I can at any time decide to stay like in Taiwan or Oxford for more than 1 week. So the point here is that once you have the freedom to fork, then you have the potential to decentralize the system. If you find that the vessel needs a different steering, you still have the steering wheel. But for most of the time, people will probably stay in a polycentral fashion, some of those central hub points. But that's not because they don't like decentralization. It's precisely because they have the right to move away that these polycentral points of contact can be metastable.
And I wouldn't discount the power of kind of social pressure in these kinds of systems and say that only the technology provides a hard kind of constraint. I mean, I think how many countries right now have no meaningful democratic mechanisms and yet have presidents, right? And I think that's a sign of the power of the social protocol. There are monarchies, they're perfectly capable of becoming monarchies, but they recognize that the kind of mood in the room at the United Nations means it's probably better for them to call themselves a president, even if in no way their behavior reflects that. And even as long as they do, it still creates a kind of a kind of pressure on them that their citizens sometimes can exact to say, well, if you call yourself a president, let's actually, let's take this seriously. It keeps the seed there. And to me, that is one of the most powerful, it is a question that is terrifying and thrilling about this kind of possibility about a different metapolitics, is what kinds of norms are going to start to take hold, and what kinds of, and so I'm so glad that when Audrey's thinking about this, it's not just about what can we encode into the technology, it's also what kind of norms do we want to be widespread as, as new kinds of protocols are spreading, in technological forms and in other kinds of, through other kinds of mechanisms.
Exactly. And the lines being really blurred, right? Once you have a very good norm around these ideas, and you have programmable cryptography, and you have a strong enough language model tuned to both worlds, then you can actually turn some of those ideas into actual code, protocol design, carrying kind of physics-like code power that instantiates those ideas. And some of that is being explored by deepgov.org, which is a funding mechanism using these kind of agents, politicians that are aligned through broad listening and police technologies to do funding allocation. But you can think of it's not just doing funding allocation, that's just the first round, but also doing like layer 2 protocol design and whatnot.
I think it also works on the opposite direction, which is like, and I think the blockchain is a good example of that. It's like sometimes by creating a particular technological artifact, it creates affordance and constraints that force an actual governance and societal innovation on top, because you have to, right? And I think the decentralized nature of the blockchain has actually created an incredible amount of governance innovation, because you need to figure out distributed governance, and it goes in the positive and the negative direction, but the technological design is actually a trigger that force the social technical system to also innovate at the social level. One of the important agenda point, I guess, of the network nation is, of course, we want to make sure that civil society gets actually empowered to act as a political actor. And we often have these questions when we present network nation and so forth, where people are like, great, how is that different from a well-working online community, right? And I think that's an important component, because of course it's not just an online community. And so what we're trying to understand is also from a design perspective, like how can we ensure that these metapolitical structure that we create actually enable political emergence, but at the level of recognizing the community as a political actor, and also being able to act as a political actor through collective action. And perhaps I think, Nathan, you've been working a lot on all the question of cooperative and so forth. And it's like, there is a lot, like the cooperative is an interesting vessel which has a lot of push toward commoning and mutualism, similarly to the network nation, but it remains mostly driven by economical motives, right? And so, but yet they have been experimenting a lot with this thing. So to which extent would you see, what is the shift between just being like aggregating together because we have a common economical reason to commune, versus commoning and creating mutualism and entanglement as a political premises?
Well, first of all, I just want to underscore what you said earlier about the what happened with the emergence of blockchains and the kind of breaking of the server client relationship. It really did unleash an explosion of of governance experimentation. That's something that, got a group of us to come together and form this organization MetaGov and be like, okay, let's have a space in which we can compare notes on all that's going on here, because none of us can keep it all in our head at once. And it's what happened in some jurisdictions where, my town here in Boulder, Colorado, is having our first citizens assembly right now. But in places around the world where people have gotten to this earlier, or with participatory budgeting, when cities open the door to say, we want to create a new form of participation, now we need tools for it, really, really interesting experiments start happening. And I think that's one of the things that's so important about metapolitics. When you shift the ground and some of the premises of organizational life, really cool explosions of creativity can occur. In this context, around cooperatives, what are the right metaphors for for thinking about lessons from past history? I think there are some interesting metaphors from cooperatives, and I love them dearly, and that's a big part of my life and work. But actually, I think in a lot of respects, the comparison does fall short for exactly the reason you said. Cooperatives are really, really designed around a common business, a common enterprise. And I think that's a bit too limiting for thinking about politics, which is really about a much more comprehensive view of our lives and what they're for, and what we need to flourish. Cooperatives, I think, do a lot more of that than other kinds of businesses, but they're still businesses. In these conversations, with you, the first thing that I started thinking about when I was reading your work on this idea, Primavera, is religion. I think that's where you get a lot more similarity. I'm Roman Catholic with Jewish ancestors, and part of a few other world religions in the mix in my family history and so forth. And in each of these, I see a transnational network that has forms of economic value, that does like a lot of the stuff that people are aspiring toward with these with network nations, with network states, whatever term you want to use. Like, it just sounds a lot like religion to me a lot of the time. And I spent a lot of my life, studying and writing about religion, and I just see these intersections a lot. And you think of the power that these institutions have held. You think about the role that they play at global institutions like the United Nations. Balaji Srinivasan talks about diplomatic recognition for network states. Well, religions, to a large degree, develop diplomatic recognition, and of course, there is this guiding idea, this kind of metaphysical vision that I think a lot of people interested in technology and so forth start getting really nervous about. But to some degree or another, we're going to start having to have that conversation, because, hey, the nation state is built on that. As Benedict Anderson, famously argued in his idea of imagined communities, the nation state is built on a kind of religious idea of a state that transcends anybody's actual direct experience. And yet, you can fly from California to Maine, and everybody believes they're part of this same mythical idea of the United States of America. And so I think there's a lot about religion that we need to take seriously if this stuff is really going to fit within the kind of puzzle piece, or fit with the puzzle piece of human beings. And the question to me is, what kind of religion is this going to be? What kind of belief system and shared, as Margaret Levi talks about, the shared community of fate is going to be involved here. I don't think you're going to get a deep sense of belonging with just technical protocols and digital networks.
And yeah, this makes a lot of sense. What is the religion? What is the new religion that is not a religion? So in some way, it's also like it's a question
what's
of
so wrong with it being a religion?
Yeah, well,
yeah,
what's
I
wrong?
guess we just need to reconnotate. But I think it's extremely relevant, because like if we think about nation states, they claim their political power because of the territorial sovereignty that they have, right? Like political power comes from territorial control. In the case of corporations, the power comes from capital. And so they acquire political capital because they have so much capital. The concept of religion is interesting. Like they do have political power, and it comes from, I guess, kinship and culture.
And
or
capital
belief.
and land.
And they acquire capital and land as a result of that. So network nations, those new political actors, what can they derive their political power from?
So Primavera and I first met over this tribe, right? That is online, that was intentionally designed by a serious evangelical Christian, Larry Wall, who basically applied a lot of his trainings as an evangelical person, and also Shinto and other Japanese culture elements into designing Perl, not just as a computer language, but also as a form of people coming together, a communion of sorts. And his documents for designing Perl was called Apocalypsis, and Exegesis, and Synopsis. And I wrote a apocrypha. But anyway, the point I'm making is that if you think about the wider communities around open source, free software, Creative Commons, later on open government, and nearby adjacent, let's just call them open movements. And exactly as Nathan said, right? It started as a belief, an idea, a common kind of doctrine, if you will, but then it translated to real economic power because it is a new engine to not just share the burden of maintenance cost, but also make permissionless innovation like literally negative cost. Like it gets rewarded if you can, find some bugs, bounties, and things like that. And therefore, we acquired collectively as the part of open movement, not just economic power, but also agenda setting power when it comes to politics through movements to fight like the old cryptographic wars against export control and things like that. And so I think this unifying imagination is really key, and it can translate to economic, political agenda setting and other powers exactly the way Nathan described as other organized religions do.
Right. I think another point we're trying to make with network nations, and we're trying to, juxtapose this concept a little bit to the network state, is kind of the theory of change, right? So how can we empower civil society to become a political actor on a global scale? It's a question of how can you enable communities bottom up, to connect with like-minded communities around the world and start coordinating around shared goals. And I think what sets us a little bit apart from, amongst many things, I guess, but amongst these is also the what sets us apart from network state is the idea of self-sovereignty. I feel it's like an important principle to enable any given community to act and operate in a way which is not infringed by external entities. But I think a lot of the techno-political imaginations we are seeing out there are starting from the hypothesis of the self-sovereign individual, right? Like empowering the autonomy and the agency of often, highly influential, high net worth individuals to expand their reach into new domains. I think we are interested in a different notion, which we working title, I guess, at the moment, but call self-sovereign communities. So what does it take in terms of building infrastructure? And with this, maybe also coming back to the question of like meta politics and tech designs, what does it take to build an infrastructure that enables civic communities to operate in a self-sovereign way and, coalesce around these shared goals? And I feel like this idea and notion of self-sovereignty is here really critical, because we are living in a world, of course, where a lot of different forces, specific, corporate agglomerations of power, but also like autocratic forces are encroaching on the space of democratic deliberation and democratic life per se, I think. So the question of how to protect these spaces of coordination, deliberation, and, political organization becomes more and more pressing. So I wonder if you have some ideas on how we can design these spaces in a way that A, allows the bottom-up, emergence of these political agents, but B, in a way which is protected against forces which are trying to, delimit that space.
So one thought is that this corresponds to the solidarity pack, the fifth pack of the six pack of care framework. In it, we argue that just as in the alignment assembly in Taiwan, we sent SMS from the trusted number 111 to 200,000 random numbers around Taiwan. This is a way to combat the kind of coercion or trolling or Sybil attacks and things like that, right? Because you know that it is very difficult to capture such a process if you go like literally randomly to 200,000 numbers. And from the civil society side, we're now popularizing this idea of meronymity or selective disclosure. It's a way to prove, for example, that you are a resident of Taiwan and therefore part of the polity that try to set the rules of Facebook entering Taiwan or Uber entering in Taiwan. But in doing so, you do not have to reveal where you live, or you need to prove you're between 16 and 45 because you're deliberating on use policy. But then again, you don't have to disclose your birthday or your name or things like that. Without such selective disclosure, verifiable credentials, nowadays it's trivial for one malicious AI swarm operator to masquerade as people in that network nation and therefore take over the vibes of whatever community there is. So a very strong protected deliberator composition based on such verifiable credentials, but with some way to shield those deliberators from doxing, that is to say, from getting their personal details revealed. I think this is absolutely critical infrastructure, which is why we released the decentralized ID wallets from the Taiwanese government in open source. So actually Creative Commons Zero, no copyright, so that if you don't trust the government, but do trust your local church or temple or mosque, they can fork that wallet and still become interoperable and still issue verifiable credential in which you can prove that you're of a legal age or you belong to this organized religion without doxing yourself.
I think this is it's such an important question to be asking, and it's a really dangerous question. The way things are going right now, this conversation is headed in really dystopian ways, right? That are going to enable some of the worst tendencies of our current tech economy to just have more power and fewer constraints. And you see this in how, for instance, Srinivasan is building the network state empire through essentially an investment fund, and all the kind of accoutrement that go with it, like accelerators and camps where people are not taken care of well, and all kinds of things, movies we've seen before. And the result of that is centralized power, even when he doesn't really say that explicitly in a lot of contexts. We see where it's going with the practice. And I think back to, I've been having conversations lately with a prominent archaeologist named Gary Feynman, who's done a lot of work on looking across ancient civilizations at what seemed to determine, or what's it not determine, but what seemed to accompany different kinds of governance structures. And he, a lot of his work's been really powerful and eye-opening in recent years, showing that it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Hierarchy is not the only way to manage large, complex societies. But economic forces are really, really important. And so I think the infrastructure that, we need to be really attentive to is the flows of resources and control over resources. In these ancient civilizations, if people were dependent on imported resources that a small elite could control, that small elite was in control of that society. That's where you get, big pyramids with kings inside. When you have a society that is totally dependent on, on some external resources. And so we need to be really aware of how these economic flows are going and figure out how to ensure that we have something, if we want more democratic, more participatory outcomes, that can really compete with or just undermine, the kind of venture capital centralization story that seems to be really taking hold. A couple of techniques I think that are important. One is getting there first. That's how protocols often get set, and I hate to say it because I like, slow and deliberate processes, but that's how protocols form. It's really important to set the mold, set the pattern in place. And I think one way that we can do that, if we're interested in these kind of more democratic outcomes, is starting with civil society, as you're saying, not just as partners, but as actually helping them recognize you are forming network nations already. Build on build on the existing infrastructure, build on the things that are already out there. Help them build the kind of the last mile that they need to go from being, powerful transnational networks in the previous regime to being the harbingers of the new regime, and be able to get there, build these scaled things, recognize them, rename them, tell a new kind of story about what these things are. That's a way, to beat the venture capitalists to their own game, to get there first. I think the second thing is to think about poison pills. What are the ways that you can make doing the wrong thing just so painful that nobody's going to do it. My favorite poison pill is the Green Bay Packers, football team. It's everybody, everybody's favorite American football team, because it's still in the small town while every other team has gone to the biggest cities and abandoned their roots. The Green Bay Packers are there because they have an ownership structure that says if this team were to sell, all the money would just go to local nonprofits. Nobody would get rich. So nobody's going to do it. Great. You end up with a really pro-social outcome. Let's think about ways in which we can just make these systems, make it painful to do something other than the right thing, and to make sure we have really strong primitives too for things like, soul-bound identity, ensuring that bypassing people and just focusing on tokens is just not, is not done. It's not something you have to do. We've got the tools available for doing it the right way. So if you're not doing it the right way, there's probably something wrong with you. These kinds of mechanisms, I think, really need to be established and socialized to prevent others from swooping in too quickly and setting a really dangerous set of norms.
Just one follow-up very briefly, because I'm just so I'm 100% with everything you just said, Nathan. I think one bottleneck though, which is very crucial and which we are also still trying to tackle in our thinking, is the question of funding and scale, right? Because the common challenge against a lot of the things which we all stated in the past minutes is that this is nice in theory and it's cool to run an experiment on this in a small community, but if we want to roll this out on like a civic level around the globe, then we need to compete with global platforms, and there is just not enough funding within civic society, and maybe not even in the public sector anymore at this point, to even build infrastructures that can compete on that level. Well, so I wonder, to a certain extent, if that argumentation is flawed in itself already, and if there is a different starting point to the question we should consider. So is the goal always, to achieve the certain scale that we can compete with these kind of, megalomaniac, massive infrastructure which are being built by big tech, or is there maybe a different theory of change that we can apply here?
This is a lesson I learned from cooperatives, right? Is that it's actually very weird that tech startup culture is all about, we've got to start from nothing and go to everything. That is a really expensive proposition. And, for better or worse, they've figured out the economic models to make that work. But that's a weird and screwed up way of doing things. And what cooperatives do when and cooperatives have a really, really hard time doing that because they don't have access to those mechanisms. But what cooperatives are really good at is taking existing economies and actually just making them more efficient. I mean, a case of this that, people might be familiar with is like mutual funds, where you have, where people started realizing, oh, wait a second, if we just took all the investing that people were already doing and put it in something that they co-owned, and they decided they're not going to pay the super exorbitant fees to the fund managers, and they're just going to kind of do it at cost and reduce costs as much as possible. They could actually totally form the financial sector. You have national scaled cooperatives in some industries, like for instance hardware in the United States, agriculture in a lot of parts of the world, where you're able to build massive businesses not by starting from scratch, but by taking what's already happening and reorganizing it a little bit, shifting some layer of some key layer of the economic activity, and redirecting it in a different way, and suddenly you're able to build a very large business, a very large kind of economic system, without having to reinvent everything, because what you're doing is essentially reorchestrating the fabric of society that's already there, and you're valuing what's already there. My grandfather ran a national cooperative of hardware stores. He did that not by starting from one hardware store and building out to all of them. He did that by creating an opportunity that lots of hardware stores and distributors that were already there, that he wanted to support, that enabled them to do their business better. And I think that's the chance to figure out, how can we use what's already out there?
So my mom actually was a founder of the Homemakers Union. At the time, started as a kind of environment-friendly agricultural idea promotion association, but very quickly became a consumer co-op. So the same logic that Nathan described works not only on the producer side, it also works on the buyer side. And homemakers already have to buy groceries anyway. So this is not about scaling out something. It is about scaling across many different communities so that they come up with a protocol that, oh, we will only buy like organic farming products or something, and then coming up with some way to negotiate with the producers, bypassing the existing intermediaries. But if you look at what the individual members of this still now Taiwan largest consumer co-op do, well, they still just go to buy groceries. They do exactly the same thing they do before, just with a slightly different protocol that enable its replication much easier across smaller communities. And so scaling across is much easier than scaling out when you're working from the buyer side.
We call this fractal scaling as opposed to scaling up, because it's kind of like you're fractalizing the system and then interconnecting. And I think it's interesting because this is actually like what we're trying to do with the network nation is not necessarily like we're trying to convey a concept and a framework, but indeed the goal with this conveyance is that many people all of a sudden have this new thing in their head, and all of a sudden they can see the world and they can actually see that they might already be part of a lot of those network nation. It's just that they didn't know the concept existed, and so they couldn't see them. And by giving them this kind of conceptual framework, we hope to help people that are already a network nation to realize that they are, and then of course take action, and not just be an online community or not just be like a group of friends, but actually recognize that you are a political actor, which can also take action and have political impact.
Do you have a sense of what those next steps are?
The next step for
when you realize that you're part of a thing that could be a network nation, what are the things you have to do to make it really a network nation?
Yeah, I mean, we try to have this recipe, and then we realize that there is no step by step. I think it's more like there are different things that can be done that can enhance. I think the first step, if there is one step, is the naming, right? Naming things into existence. And I think the moment in which you have a group of people that starts naming themselves as a network nation, as opposed to as a group or as a collective, already, if the word network nation means anything, it's already changing the flavor. Like all of a sudden, there is a state shift, because now we are a network nation. Now all of a sudden, things will start becoming a network nation because we name it like such, we recognize ourselves as such, and others start recognizing us as this. And all of a sudden, it has a performative effect. The way in which you conceive of a group will also modify how the group interacts amongst each other and how others interact with the group. So I would say like step number 111 baseline is owning the concept as part of the collective. And then I think there is just like many different ways, many different axes that can be walked through. I think there is the question of mutualization of resources, commoning, the question of entanglement, the question of actually like defining what is the shared societal vision that we want and so forth. So there is a lot of possible step that goes in different direction, but the more you walk into those directions, the more likely to become a network nation you are. And I don't think there is like a before and after, right? It's a progressive. You start as a proto network nation and then you progressively evolve into the network nation. But yeah, this is part of the work that we also want to do, is naming what are those different steps and what are those different like trajectory that can be pushing towards more network nationness. But I think just the recognition, I think, has extreme good power, because I do think there is so many network nation already out there, but we just don't know about them because they don't know about themselves.
And maybe I will just add one thing, because I think in our observation there are different entities which qualify as at least proto-network nations, as Primavera said, but they're starting from very different places. So you have partially very historical structures like, diasporas, which are network communities across the world, which share a lot of features with what we, like think of when we describe network nations, but they're lacking the technical and governance substrate often to coordinate more effectively on an international scale, right? A lot of diasporas are still in this kind of like process of trying to claim either territory or trying to establish a state, which is very much, within the imaginary of the Westphalian system. So on that end, like it might be the first move might be towards establishing some sort of like network governance. On the other end, you have a lot of experiments which have amazing technical governance structures, especially in the Web3 space, right? Like DAOs, for instance, who are very sophisticated systems partially, but not necessarily like a community of kinship and a shared aspiration and imaginary about their own community, their belonging, and their vision of the future. So in this sense, their culture and other identity formatting activities might be much more needed. So it's really about understanding like the starting point from which these different entities are venturing out into this kind of journey. But yeah, as Primavera said, I think part of our work is now to kind of outline these different pathways, and we would be super thrilled about bringing also more people into this kind of work.
And that is one last important discussion that we want to have with both of you, which is something that is oftentimes used as a criticism against like the recipe of biology towards network states. But I think it's something that could potentially also apply as a criticism to network nation. And it's the question of, if a network nation is a voluntary opt-in type of network, and of course we all want it to be a voluntary opt-in, there is obviously a risk that it leads to somehow a very maybe too aligned set of individuals. And one of our baseline hope for network nation is of course that because we have people from all around the world that belong to this network nation, we might actually ideally increase the breadth and the scope or the coverage of potential different opinions and so forth, so that we might be able to address some of the global challenges that nation states which are too focused on their territory fail to address, or corporations which are too profit-oriented also fail to address. The challenge, of course, is that because it's an opt-in thing, what happens if we end up with like network nations that are just people agreeing with each other, and there is absolutely no variety and enough diversity or plurality in order to actually have meaningful conversation that can lead to a better opinion in the end, and therefore being able to address global challenges because of the diversity of at least in the deliberation process. And so maybe like Audrey, I think you probably have like a strong opinion on that, but Nathan as well, is like, how do we actually design this framework that at the same time invite as much diversity both at the value and at the opinion level, but also that help understand that this diversity is a positive thing because it can enable better operations if we manage to bridge them. But then how do we ensure that on the one hand, so one risk is that not enough diversity, only very value aligned people, and therefore quite weak at the deliberation level, or too much diversity, but then we cannot bridge amongst them, and then nothing happens, but there is a paralysis because we cannot get to agree on anything.
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, democracy needs to be fast, fair, and fun, right? There's no trade-off between the three. Once you start making the trade-off, then you got into the kind of situation you just described, in which there's no fun in talking to people who are too different. And so you just admit people who are similar, which is fast and arguably fair, but not at some points not fun at all, right? Because you need diversity in order to have enjoyment. And so I think a quick way to turn conflict into co-creation and a culture that builds this approaching effect, that is to say, we actively enjoy crossing longer distances, giving large bridging bonuses to people who are so different from us that there's an overflow and there's a wraparound, right? We need to really celebrate this kind of crossing large distances as part of the culture. Otherwise, it risks becoming a cult and not a culture. And then it will become like a self-limiting idea. And so to scale across, you need to celebrate long distances and the resolution of long distance differences and conflicts, and really take enjoyment in the quick and fair resolution.
Yeah, and I think it's a really deep challenge, and one thing one frame that I used to think about it a bit is this idea of innovation amnesia, which is this pattern in which people seem to, when something new shows up, discard important things that they had fought hard to establish in previous generations. For example, we could think about the way in which when you switch from sending your mail through the postal service to Gmail, suddenly you trade a system that doesn't spy on you to a system that does, and you just accept it because wow, it's so fast and pretty. Or you switch from taxis to app-based rideshare and dispense with generations of labor protections that were that people fought hard for. And I talked before about the the Federal Reserve. Like, yeah, we can have all kinds of critiques, but wait a second, let's make sure that we still have an economic system that cares whether people are employed. And I think this is another reason that I think the really, really crucial dividing line between the network state idea, which is built on startup disruption, and a network nation idea could be the idea of building on what's already there. Building on the good things that we have established, where we have good universal healthcare programs. Let's not blow those up and hope that we can reconstruct them, because we in the United States know that that's really hard, and we've been struggling to do that for decades, and we can't manage to figure it out. And for those of you who have it, keep it. And figure out how to build other layers on top of that, and maybe someday you'll replace it with something better. But be careful with the inheritances that we have from past generations. And as we build into the future, let's see if we can build on those shoulders for the next things, and not lose the gifts that we've been given. That is, I think, both like the risk and the real opportunity for this kind of thinking about a new metapolitics. How do we relate to the past, and how do we make sure that we don't forget the good things that we need to hold on to?
So within our intentional communities, which we hope eventually will grow into a network nation, we have this I don't know, this thought, I guess, which we call the plurality paradox, which is essentially this actually acknowledgement from, I guess, a small degree of empirical experience, that the more aligned people are at the value level, then the more we can actually hold diversity at the opinion level. And then, because if you share the same value, it becomes very fun I guess, are very interesting to actually discuss different opinions, because we know that we're standing on the same ground, and it just happens that conceptualization of the world has led to us having different opinions. And so it's interesting to explore the thinking space to understand why, given the same value, we have different opinion. Vice versa, if you have people with very different values, it might become extremely complex to deliberate or to argue or to debate, because the opinion almost don't matter if the value are clashing. And so one question that I would love to hear from both of you is, like, in terms of like these political actors that we are trying to craft with the network nation, what is actually leading to stronger political capacity? Is it more important to have an accumulation of values in order to hold the diversity of opinion as a positive space of debate? Or shall we actually try to identify people perhaps that have diverse values, but that are united by the same problems or the same societal vision, and therefore we'll also have to somehow figure out a way to work together, even though the values are different? What's your opinion on this?
Well, I stumbled on care ethics and specifically civic care from John Toronto precisely because she treated the ability for a community's relationships within those communities to have a healthiness when it comes to the difference of opinions, the ability to resolve them, to be attentive and take care of each other, and so on, as the primary thing to watch out and to design for. This is in opposition to most other values in virtue ethics, which is about individuals who must strive to be, I don't know, courageous, or to have great temperaments, or to have this compassionate, or the ability to show empathy and so on, which are all individual level traits. The problem of these is that if you cultivate for those individual based traits, it is almost always to the implicit exclusion of the other traits that these individuals maybe have no taste buds for, right? Because people are neurodiverse. For some people, some virtues are simply less accessible than other virtues. But if you design for civic care, then basically you're looking for people who are inhabiting or are vessels of relationships that are healthy and can cultivate such relationships with people who may hold different taste buds, but are also committing to the idea of civic care. So it's almost like aligning to a community practice or process instead of like the individual attributes or traits. And I find that to be very attractive and also agrees with my experience with many intentional communities.
Yeah, I think I want to go back to that word entanglement that you used earlier. I mean, I think that's really important piece of the story, and that values, I think, can only be part of it. Values are kind of hard for humans to hold for too long, I think, in a certain respect, and they bounce all over the place. I mean, we experience that very deeply right now in this country, where you know the our values have diverged so profoundly in so many respects, and what holds us together is often just like appearances and just like these weird little like social norms about like how you show up in a space, how you drive a car, how just like the ability to live together, um going to places of worship together. These just basic norms are like the tendrils holding us together, and they look a little more like ritual than values, because they're not actually, we have different stories that we tell about why we're doing that thing, but we're still doing the same thing. And the political philosopher John Rawls talked about overlapping consensus that holds a society together, and I think that consensus can look a lot of different ways, which might be a good thing. Some network nations, it might be values. Others, it might be, a thing we do together. And we have very different values, and that's okay. And sometimes, for instance, in my religious community, it's the one place in my life, a lot of the times it feels like, where I'm in contexts where people have different political beliefs, and we're brought together by a shared ritual and a shared story and history. And I think you need to recognize that it's that thick structure of human life that enables us to hold our societies together. And the entanglement is that recognition that even when we're very different, if we become entangled with each other, that's a way of enabling diversity to flourish, right? Countries that are deeply economically entangled tend not to go to war with each other because it's just too painful. I think one of the scariest things that's going on right now in the world is the disentanglement of economic life. That can pave a way to really, really dangerous conflict. And we have to be aware about like the risk again that we take if we challenge the nation state. I mean, I live in a region that has deep problems with water. If we weren't all part of the same country, we would probably be at war. Colorado would be at war with New Mexico or whatever, because like there's just not enough water to go around and to let us do all of our things. And so we need to be very careful, recognize we haven't talked about violence so far, but I think that's a question that we need to take really, really, really seriously, because it's a part of the human story. It's a part of what we're capable of. And when we break apart or when we reimagine our political life, we need to make sure that we're really deeply attentive to that risk of kind of the worst parts of our nature coming forward in ways that they are already all around us, but could surface even worse.
I would like to build a little bit on your reflection, also maybe bring this fascinating conversation to an end. I think it's like a beautiful picture you're painting, this need to kind of flesh out a political community, which can, carry these ideas that we are discussing here. And I think this is also a question we, of course, asking ourselves for this platform we're trying to build for network nations, and maybe which other, organizers are also asking themselves, who want to, bring about different instantiations of, like digital democracies of the future. Is the question basically of like, how do we build like a compelling narrative which is, capturing the public imagination? And I think like one trap we sometimes probably tend to fall into these kind of spaces where we are operating in is that we are, of course, being sometimes slightly theoretical about these topics. There's a lot of abstraction involved in discussing governance, discussing institutional designs, in this discussing, the intersections of technologies and all of that. And to many people, citizens around the world, this feels a little bit remote sometimes. So I wonder how we build a narrative, maybe for network nations, but also other instantiations, like plurality and like the cooperative movement and so on, which allows us to broaden the platform, which allows us to bring in, groups which we haven't, enclosed in our echo chamber yet. And I wonder if you have some ideas on, like what this kind of narrative would have to entail, how we would have to send this message out. And maybe we can conclude with that.
I'll say a bit and then leave it to Audrey to wrap us up with something better. But I think it's got to start by by bringing responses to people's real challenges. It cannot be an abstraction. Marxism spread because the workers were suffering, and this idea was presented as, hey, this is a pathway to the classless society, and more importantly, to like having bread on your table every day. And the Westphalian nation state came about not because everyone was suddenly convinced that this was the greatest idea. It came about because there were wars that just seemed intractable until we figured out some kind of compromise, and this is a compromise people could live with. And I think when we look at contexts like Gaza, when we look at contexts like Sudan, the crisis of politics in the United States, I think we need to make sure to apply these ideas to those spaces. Those are all spaces, and there are many more where the nation state is rupturing, and climate crisis. That's where we need to focus, is how can these tools be usable for bringing about solutions that people otherwise aren't seeing in front of them because they can only think in terms of what nation states are capable of.
Yeah, and it's important to realize the wins we had as the broader open movement. I mean, Wikipedia is still top 10 websites. There are more and more people using Signal, Proton, all of these tools that are precursors, right, or really enabling factors of those network nation aspirations are already everyday tools that solves everyday problems for everyday people. And so the importance, I think, is not just to invent new things, but just to popularize the idea that, okay, in some other domains, for example, not many people know that something that's like GPT-4 that does reasoning well, like O3 level, can run locally on your laptop. And actually, if you tune it a little bit, then it doesn't hallucinate as much anymore, right? So this kind of local edge open source AI is already everyday technology, but not many people know about these, right? So just making popular those ideas that already get embodiment into everyday technologies can make interoperability the norm, because the more people using these technologies and protocol, the more natural it will feel to them to feel that, okay, nations may be united, states may be united, but networks, they are only interdependent and interoperable. And once they got into this interoperable kind of thinking, then apply that thinking to the idea of nations or states, or nation states become second nature.
Audrey and Nathan, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. It was super generative. Let us maybe know, and especially our listeners, where we can follow your work. I'm sure a lot of them are eager and excited to, get involved and learn more about it.
Yeah, you can find my own work at nathanschneider.info, or the work of my lab, the Media Economies Design Lab at medlab.host, or Metagov, the organization I am on the board with Primavera on, with his at metagov.org.
Great. And as a, I think, research advisor or something in MetaGov, do check out MetaGov's work. Also, interoperability between the digital deliberation tools. That's another very natural thing to bridge into. And you can find me at audreyt.org.
Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you both.